We're going to be talking about CSS selectors today. CSS selectors are what allow us to select the elements on the page that we want to style. I've got a nice video here for you that does a really good job of talking about CSS selectors and giving you a good primer to what they are. There are many different types of CSS selectors, and I've listed some of them here. Universal, element type, ID, class, attribute, pseudo class, and pseudo element are the ones I'm going to walk you through. The first one I want you to know about is the universal selector. The universal selector allows you to match any element. For example, if I wanted to color all of the text on the page red, I could use the universal selector and it would automatically apply this style rule to every single element on the page. That is why it's called a universal selector. It will universally style something. Then we have something called an element type selector. We've talked about all the different types of elements in this class already. Things like images, paragraphs, headings. Those are types of elements. So what we can do is we can specify an element type to apply a style rule to. This style rule would color all the text red, but only for H1 elements. Any H1 element on the page would have its text colored red. And so this is one way to select elements on a page by their type. Another way is based upon their ID. So you can put an ID attribute with an element in its starting tag. For example, I have an H1 element here. It has the ID of title. If I prefix title with a # with this hashtag, then I can target it to be styled however I choose. In this case, I'm going to color the text red of any element on the page whose ID attribute is title. So this allows you to style unique elements. So if you have an element on the page and there's only one of it, you can give it a unique ID and then you can style it using this syntax right here. Another way to style is to use class selectors. Let's say you have more than one thing that you want to treat the same. Let's say it's a family of elements on the page that should all be styled the same way. Well, then what you would do is you would give each element a class. You would assign them to a common class and then you could style them that way. In the start tag, you can add a class attribute, give it a name, and then if you precede that name with a dot, then you can style it however you choose. So this is for when you're trying to style multiple elements. In this example, I have an H1 element. I've given it the class of red, and then I basically said any element on the page whose class attribute is currently red, color all its text red. So this is just another way to find the elements on the page that we want to style. It's called a class selector. It uses the class attribute. Now, let's say that you want to have multiple style classes. Let's say I have an element, like this H1 element here, and I want to assign it both the red class and the italic class. I can do that by simply separating my style classes by spaces. As you can see, I have two style rules. The first one says anything that has a class red gets red text. Anything with a class italic gets its font style set to italic. Now let's get into some of the more obscure ones. An attribute selector is a CSS selector that allows you to pick elements on the screen based upon the value of some attribute. So I have an example here. In this example, I'm trying to target any link on the page, any anchor element whose target attribute has the value of blank. Down below, you'll see that on my little dummy page, I do have one anchor tag whose target attribute is blank. Therefore, there would be a match and its text would be colored red. So this is just one more way to target elements on the page. Another way you can target elements is called a pseudo class selector. It matches the state of an element. So let me talk about this for a second. When you put a link on a page, that link can have many different states. For example, let's say the link has been visited. That is one state that the link can have. Let's say that the person viewing the page is currently hovering over it with their mouse. That's another state that that element can have. What a pseudo class selector allows you to do is to style something based upon its state. For example, let's say we had an anchor tag, and whenever somebody was hovering over the link's text, I wanted the color of the text to turn blue, I could use a CSS rule that looks like this. The selector says A, and then there's a colon, and then the state that I'm looking for, which is hover. Down below in my dummy page, I have my sample link, and I've kind of shown you here in this picture how if you're hovering over the text, it will turn blue. So a pseudo class selector allows you to match a rule with some element state. For example, when an anchor is being hovered over. And this is the syntax you would use. Pseudo elements are slightly different. Let's say I had text and I wanted to style the first letter of that text. Well, then there's all of these creative pseudo elements that I can use to do so. See how it's got this double colon syntax? This example right here, I want to style the first letter of any H1 element. So as you can see over here, I want to color the first letter of the heading red, and I want to make it really big. So I've created this CSS rule that uses a pseudo element. I'm able to style the first letter using this first letter pseudo element. And this isn't the only one that there is. There's many different ones. So anytime you want to do something really special, there may be a pseudo element that can help you achieve what you're trying to accomplish. It uses this double colon syntax, and then you can refer to documentation to see what other pseudo elements you can use. Now, can I combine selectors? Absolutely. This is what makes CSS so robust, which makes it so powerful. There are two ways in which you can combine selectors. You can write multiple selectors and then separate them by commas like you were making a list, or you can use what are called combinators to combine several selectors into a new, more specific one. I always think of the combo snacks, how we're taking these two separate things, pretzel and let's say pepperoni pizza, and we're turning it into one thing by combining them. All right, multiple selectors. Let's say I wanted to style all of the H1 elements and all the paragraph elements on a page the same way. I can specify two different selectors, H1 and P. Those are both element type selectors because they basically say, hey, if you're an H1 element type, style yourself this way. If you're a P element type, style yourself this way. Instead of writing these as separate style rules, I'm able to just delimit them with commas and write one rule that satisfies everything that I want to do. So in my example, I have an H1 and a P, and you can see that they are styled the same way. All right, combinators, ways to connect selectors. There are 4 types of combinators. I don't expect you to know all these, but I want to give you some exposure to it. We have one that's called the descendant selector, one that's called the child selector, one that's called the adjacent sibling selector, and one that's called the general sibling selector. Combinators are ways of connecting selectors together. So I want you to take a look at this example. In this example, I have 2 different selectors. I have an element type selector, which is looking for a div, and I have an element type selector, which is looking for a paragraph. In this case, I'm using what's called a descendant selector. Just by separating the selectors by spaces, I'm specifying that I only want to style this P element type if it is underneath, if it is a descendant or a child of the div selector. So down below, you'll see my example. I have a div, and then inside of it, I have a paragraph that says Romeo, Romeo. In this case, I would only style a paragraph element if it was within a div. So this is what a combinator does. It allows you to take more than one selector and somehow creatively connect them in order to make a more refined, precise style rule. Now, these can get very complex, but I just wanted to show you an example of how you could target your selectors even further using a combinator. So it's very important this week that you do look up the selectors in the Mozilla Developer Network link that I have here. Pay close attention to attributes and examples. And then this is a very long but very important challenge for you to do. A lot of the stuff we talked about today is very abstract. So I want you to get hands-on practice using all the different types of CSS selectors in a real-life context. Make sure you follow the tutorial and you see me with any questions.